Hello and welcome to the Unbroken Ground. Thank you for joining me. This is Paul. This is episode 48, and this is called Darkness. And it's kind of turning in tune with last week's episode, which was talking about silence. And it's, one of the last ones we're leading into before we get to a year of episodes that will be based off of, I want to do a year of recorded episodes. And so excited about that. We have last week was silence, this week darkness, and it's leading into the last four of the year, which will be the Advent, themed on the Advent, days of Advent. So if you celebrate Advent in your church, then you'll recognize it very easily. If not, you'll get to see something that you haven't done before. It's very cool, but it's just celebrating the season of Jesus. So, episode 48, Darkness. I am recording this on location in Branson. This is my first solo, not being in my office recording. I've done some stuff where I've recorded people in other places. So this is exciting, on the road, doing a little mini vacation, and so from location, on the spot, episode 48, Darkness. Let's jump in. So I think that I like the last two themes because they're something that we work through as human beings that is pretty germane to all experience, and that is because that we deal with this idea that there is silence from God in our lives, but also we deal with the darkness that lives within us, that makes up our world, and it's a very thematic thing. I think there's a reason that light and dark is used so much in the Bible. So, for example, in the Old Testament, it says that God's word is a light unto our feet. When John begins to announce start his gospel, he actually starts it with the phrase, Jesus is the light of the world. The world was in darkness, and Jesus came to the world so that it might have light, that it might see. And I think that when I think about the very human limitations that darkness brings, it becomes very clear why this is such a common theme and why it's such an apt thing to think about before we celebrate the coming of Jesus. Before we celebrate his birth, before we celebrate his ministry, one of the things to think about is darkness. And when I think about darkness, I go immediately back to children. And I think about the fact that as children, we learn very quickly to be afraid of the dark. We learn we don't necessarily, I don't think anybody really teaches us that, but it's a very human condition to realize that when it's dark, we can't see things. And when we can't see things, we can't anticipate, we can't understand, we can't process. And so we begin to be afraid of the dark because we are vulnerable. And I think that is one of the reasons that God and the authors of Scripture really use that analogy is because we live such a life that is vulnerable. We are in the dark spiritually. We emotionally. We don't acknowledge. We live in the dark, and we very much seek ways to eliminate that because we don't enjoy that. It is something that causes us fear. We are afraid of being in the dark because we are vulnerable. We're afraid of being vulnerable. We are there are prey animals out there that can see in the dark, that have an advantage over us if we are fighting on their territory because of the dark. And so as a child, we learn very, very, very early that the darkness holds things that we fear. And of course, as adults, we know that the irrational fear of the dark is not necessary. You don't have to have that. But as children, fears, it doesn't really matter if they're irrational or not. They're there. And so we learn that when we can't see things, when we can't know things, when we can't process things, then we lose control. And we very, very, very much are against the idea of losing control. We very, very much are against the idea of losing any kind of control, because losing control means that we have to depend upon somebody else. And so darkness brings that into focus in our lives. That if it's dark and we need to find something, then we have to have some kind of light source. There's nothing within us. There's nothing within us that can will ourselves. If you've ever been, and I have been before. It's been a long time, but if you've ever been in one of those like caves or caverns where they do a tour that is underground, and the only light source is the lights that they have put in the system, or the lamps that you carry, or the flashlights or whatever. One of the things that they're going to do, because this is what tours do, is to give you a thrill, is that they are going to have you turn off the lights, and when you do that, you begin to understand what true darkness is. And true darkness is in a cave when there's no other, you're not getting any kind of ambient light from anything that you could, no stars, no moon, no city light pollution, and you just have darkness. You literally can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't see anything. So you could be attacked by anything and from any angle, and you would just not be able to defend yourself. And there was nothing within you that you could will to see. There's nothing in you that you could go, oh, okay, well, I'll just, I'll make light appear. We actually don't have it within us to do that. We can't make our eyes adjust. We can't see in pure darkness. We just can't. We're blind. In that situation, we need light for our eyes to see, and so I think that's why it's so appropriate that when John begins to talk about who Jesus is, one of the titles he gives him is that he's light of the world. And I think that the reason it's so appropriate at this time is that we struggle with so much information. We feel like we know so much, so many things, that we have such knowledge, that we are smarter than we've ever been, that we have more knowledge. We understand the universe and humans and how the world works more than we ever have. And yet there's still so much we just don't understand, and there's still so much that we are not in control of, and we're so haphazard with it. We use good things and that causes death and destruction because we don't know what we're doing. We don't understand because we're not actually in control, and that causes us great stress because we want to be kind of the controllers of our own destiny, the controllers of the things that we have, so that we can say that we are in charge of things. And that's just not the way this world works. And so, because that's the case, the world doesn't work that way. We do need light. And there's nothing within us that can bring about that knowledge. We can't think hard enough. We can't try hard enough to receive the truth of who Jesus is. That's not like one of the I've been thinking through a lot of objections that people have to following Jesus, and there's a lot of good-natured, honest people who are like, well, I don't think you need a book to teach you to be a good person. But I would just argue that I think historically it's shown that people, unless there's some kind of overarching authority, whatever that might be. Now you can say that is your government, you can say that is your community, that's your love, your family, whatever that is, that unless there's some kind of overarching authority to direct you on what is good, what is kind, what is nice, what is love, that we don't come up with good definitions of that on our own. That the people who are like, well, there's morality and you don't need the Bible for morality, actually have learned, because the Bible can't be separated from the history of thought and philosophy and morality. They've learned all those good things because there is a scripture, or there's a principle that's pointed to that, but we just don't come up with it on our own. Because if let's walk down the pathway where we say, oh well, there's nothing that created us, so we don't have a creator. We don't have anybody that can explain to us how the world might work, or why the world works the way it works. Okay, then what is the best thing to do? Well, if there is no order to this world, then the best thing to do would be whatever is best for you. Now, it may be best for you to act in such a way to create community, which is also, I think, what anyone who follows Jesus would say, that you want to be in community. And so that may be the best thing for you, but it's driven from a selfishness. It's driven from, as long as that works. If that's not the best thing, some people who are very good at killing things, at killing people, would think that the best thing was, hey, the strongest survive. So if you're gonna have, there's no rules, there's no morality established by anything other than just whatever we want to do, then the strongest person is going to be right, because might is right, and there's no reason to just not believe that, because if there's no system, if there's no accountability, if it's always just whatever is best for the person, then that person who is the strongest will have the most, because they have the best advantage of doing the most, because they're the strongest, and no one can tell them no, because they're the strongest. And then of course what happens is that you have people who want to benefit from that strength, who may not have that strength, will then flock to them and follow them and create that relationship, because they want what that person has, but they don't have the strength to take it. So they instead align themselves, community. And it's a very self-serving move. Again, it's not because being the strongest and just taking whatever you want is the best way of things, but it is a way of things. And if it is the way things seem to be going, would you rather be on the side that says, well, I'm with the strong guy, or the side that's like, wait, that's not fair, and then just have your stuff taken anyway? So very much so, in the sense of that, if we're in a dark cave with all the lights turned off, there's nothing within me that I can create a light source. And the same way, mentally, there is nothing that would point to the type of system, the type of relationship, the type of life that God points to within just my mental makeup. Now, we have to understand that the scriptures and the truth of who Jesus is and the weight of who Jesus is has actually drug itself through all of history and academics and philosophy. And so you can't, at this point, separate that out. When you arrive at some kind of conclusion in philosophy, most of the time you're basing it off of a belief system that has been influenced by who Jesus is. And so you may say, well, I understand what love is, so I can just have a system without God and Jesus, and I can just talk about love because I've come to an understanding of that. But most times what you will find is that your understanding of love has been shaped by what God has said love is, or what society has said. But society has been shaped by God and by Jesus and by the Bible. So to think that you could somehow just divorce yourself from its influence is just incorrect. And I think that is that is one of the things that, like, if you you'd have to start in order to avoid its influence. You would just have to be like you'd have to start over. You'd have to unlearn everything. You'd have to get rid of both the good and the bad of it, and then try to start from square one. But again, there's still going to be an overarching philosophy of what you're going to follow. So there's nothing within us, I believe, that really, it doesn't mean there's not good within us, and it doesn't mean that we can't follow the good things in this life, follow society as a whole, as people, just even without having God in us, because God has kind of this what's called general grace, which just allows people to be able to live in such a way that you could love people without having to have Jesus in your heart, without having Jesus in your life. You can still love people, but the definition or your understanding of that love is going to be shaped by culture, and culture, whether you like it or not, is shaped by the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the Bible, which is Jesus, which is God. You can say you don't like that, that's fine, but you can't at this point separate out. So it's not saying that, so I wouldn't say that we as people can't have things that come out of character, like being honest and being loving and being caring. Those are all good things. We can do those without having to have Jesus in our hearts. But some of those major definitions are when we begin to think about how do you belong to a community, and what does that look like, and what's the further explanation of that. What you find is that you have such a strong influence from certain things, and one of them is Judeo-Christian values, that you can't separate out without just creating a whole new system. Maybe that can be done. I don't know if you can create a whole new system. I think some people are trying. But again, the idea that if there is no cosmic rule in the world, if there is no cosmic power in the world, if it's all just by chance, if we all just ended up here by chance, if the collection of molecules that makes up me are just a happy, chaotic happenstance, and there is no full creator of the world, there's no overarching order to the world, then what are you going to base your system off of? Because even people, I think, that are like, oh, I don't believe in God in the Bible or any gods at all. A lot of them still believe in things like fate or fairness or destiny. And but the question then they have to answer, they have to think through, is that who's in control of that destiny? Who's in control of that fate? If there's no overarching strong power that is actually doing that, then they can't declare that they have their they're kind of their own captain, and they can't be upset when fairness isn't in play, because there's no rule. As a society, we can decide those things, I guess, but again, who decides what's fair? Because we are selfish individuals, and so deciding what's fair oftentimes doesn't work out like we think it would. What's fair is that, again, you could say what's fair is that the strongest individual gets the most talented, the best looking, whatever metric you want to use, which we can rank people by. But what's fair? Oh, we're all going to have things in common. Well, one of the reasons that we would say that, we're going to have things in common, which is crazy, because communism very much was very against any kind of faith. But if we think about it, like, the only reason the idea of communism really comes out of community, which is really a idea from God. So if you think about it, it's just crazy, because the idea that we all are in common really comes from the fact that we're all created equal, which is what Americans have put into the Constitution, right? We believe that all men were created equal. They were equal because we're all creation. That it's not easy to say, or even doesn't make sense to say we're equal because we're all the same happy accidents. Even if somebody would say that, I'm not saying that atheists would say that. I'm just saying that if you begin to say that, well, we have this equality, the reason we have the equality is because we all are children of our Creator. And because we're all created, none of us have more inalienable rights than the others. And so, I mean, a lot of that, again, is just based off of this Judeo-Christian. So that's a long way around to think back to this. We as people, as followers of God, we have to struggle through these ideas of things like silence and darkness. Because silence, this ability to hear or to not hear God, and darkness, this ability for God to stay hidden from us, create a challenge to our relationship with God. If God is silent, how do we relate to God? If God is hidden, how do we know God? And so we have to deal with the fact that at some point, our lives are going to experience, as we talked about last week, a time of silence from God. And also, our lives are going to have points of darkness in it, points where we have a hard time seeing God. There's, again, I think if you read through the Psalms, you will see reference to both of those things time and time again, which actually points to the idea that it is more common of a human experience than we really hope or expect. Like we would hope or expect that those would be very uncommon experiences because we don't want those type of things in our lives. We just want to always just be connected and close and clear and always be able to hear, always be able to see, always be able to know. And yet, if you read through the Psalms, you see verse after verse where it says, God, why have you forsaken me? God, why have you hidden yourself from me? God, where did you go? Psalm 23, one of the most loved Psalms in the whole Bible, has this line. It says, even though I walk through the shadow of death, even though I walk through darkness, your rod and your staff, you comfort me. But the question, the phrase is not, I will not walk through the shadow of death. I will never have to walk through the shadow of death. No, the phrase in the psalm is, even when I walk through the shadow of death, which again points to it being a normative experience by those who follow Jesus. They're going to experience times of hardship and trouble. Jesus said it himself. Jesus, when he's preparing his disciples for his eventual death and him leaving, he says, "Be of good cheer." He says this. He says, "In this world, you're going to have trouble." Let me say that again because I stumbled through that. But this is what Jesus says. Jesus says in John, he says, "In this world, you are going to have trouble, but be of good cheer. I will overcome the world." Let me say it again, because I think we need to hear it and meditate on it. In this world, you will experience trouble, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. It's the same thing. Jesus doesn't say, hey, if you follow me, no more trouble for you. If you follow me, you won't have to worry about struggles. You won't worry about hard times. You don't have to worry about that. That's not what he says. He says, in this world, you're going to face hard times, struggles, darkness. There are going to be times where you don't understand. There are going to be times when you pray for something and it doesn't happen. There's going to be times when life just feels so unfair. There are going to be times when everything may be okay, but you just feel like you can't see or hear God anymore, and you just feel like you're lost in darkness. And God uses those times to shape us. Jesus doesn't say, you may have trouble in this world. He said, you will have trouble in this world. And so for people who are like, who are like, oh, God never intended us to struggle. God never intended us to have things like poverty or sickness. God's the weapon that you can't be formed against. You can't be conquered. I mean, look at Paul's life. The guy who writes those things. I mean, he talks about how he was beaten and he was left hungry and he was near death. I mean, Paul had trouble. His life was full of trouble. And yet he would write those things. He would say, be of good cheer. Well, that's what Jesus says. But he says, like, give thanks always. Rejoice. I mean, and Paul, of course, is writing these things from prison. He's writing these things in the midst of his persecution. He's saying, every day give thanks. Don't forget to pray. Don't forget to give thanks. Don't forget to rejoice at how good life is. You know that there's no weapon formed against you can prosper. You know that you reign. You are victorious. These are all the things that he writes, and he writes them from places like prison and being shipwrecked and being left on the side of the road for death, for being stoned by the people who wanted him dead, from being beaten and then put into prison, from being in shit. I mean, he writes these things that you go, but God, but Paul, your life does not reflect what you're saying. Paul's life had many, many dark places where he could have said, I don't think this is what God intended. But here's something I think that's super interesting to me. I hope it's interesting to you too. Paul was Saul, and what changed his life was an encounter that left him blind. Paul was Saul, and what changed his life was an encounter that left him blind, was an encounter that left him in darkness. He no longer could see. He had to be led around. Here's why that's interesting to me. When we go through darkness and we learn the futility and the limits of our strength, of our reason, of our control over this world, when we see all of that, it becomes clearer and clearer who God is. And so it's in times of darkness, of pain, of suffering, of loss, that God often speaks loudest. And it's times when we have everything, where everything's sunshiny and brilliant, and we can't imagine pain happening to us, that often we lose sight and understanding of who God is. And it makes sense. When you're in the dark, when you're in the cave and you're underneath ground and there's no light, you turn off the lights, you are lost. You're vulnerable. You're afraid. The only thing that can save you is a source of light. And you can't create that in yourself. Sure, maybe you brought a lamp, maybe you brought a flashlight. But what is that going to do for your spiritual darkness? This season can be heavy with darkness. If you may be facing it for the first time after losing a loved one. You may be facing it in your families. People are celebrating these seasons and they're like, oh, I can't wait to get with the family. And you're just thinking, I wish I had a different family. I wish my family would be like that. I wish that I had that kind of joy when I thought about my family meeting. And you just feel the darkness. You feel oppressed by it. You feel it squeezing in. Maybe it's just your own faith. You've looked into things. You've asked the questions and you haven't got answers and you don't know why. Maybe you don't even know what you believe anymore. It's dark. It's lonely. You're afraid. Your spirit is crying out, seeking. As with silence, I want us to embrace a little bit of the darkness this week that unknown, that fear, that outside us, because I think that it helps us to prepare for what John will call the light of the world, for what we'll see in the Advent story and the Christmas story. But I think that, again, we fill our lives with so much. We fill our lives with so much that we move away from these things, so we don't have to deal with the spirituality of losing light, of being dark, of being in a hard place, of being in a rough place, of being dependent upon God. And so because we lose that, we lose the ability a lot of times to hear, even just hear from God. Because he can't break through when we put up the walls that are like, nope, no darkness here. We're just going to pretend like everything's okay. We're going to pretend like I don't have hurts, I don't have pain, I don't have sufferings, that I'm not crying out from the inside with doubt, that I'm not riddled, my faith isn't riddled with holes. I'm going to put on the happy mask and I'm just going to walk on. And when we do that, we continue to walk in darkness. We continue to lie to ourselves, we continue to lie to others. I want you to think this week. I want you to think about, where in my life am I allowing darkness to stay because I'm too afraid of the light revealing the truth? What is it that would be so terrible if you admit it between you and God? If you admit it to another believer? If you allow the light to come in and distill the darkness, where in your heart, in your life, in your mind, where does the darkness still stay? And if you're in a time of darkness, of loss, of pain, of grieving, just hold on. Hold on. Hold on to God. I'm not ready yet to release the full good news on the other side of darkness. I want to live here for a moment, but I do just want to say that if you're in a hard place, hold on. With all your might, hold on. And as you reflect this week, I pray that you would find those places that seem dark or that you know are dark, and that you would have the courage to ask Jesus to shine his light into those places and remove the darkness, so that you no longer carry them with you. And as he does that, may he make you more and more like the person that he wants you to be. Hope you will meditate on that this week. Hope you'll think about that. Maybe even pray that. God, show me the places of the darkness in my heart that you need to clear out. God, show me how I can do that. And as you do that, I pray that God's light will just fill you with joy and hope and strength and drive out things like fear and shame. Hope you have a good week. Looking forward to next week as we get to take off on the joys and the good things, but I do want you to meditate on just a little bit of darkness this week, thinking about in your life where it might be, and what God's trying to say through that. God bless. Hopefully hear from you next week.